Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Tony T's Tune Talk, available at the Port Washington Public Library's YouTube channel. I'm your host, Tony Triguardo, and I'm ready to talk tunes. Perhaps their band just broke up. Maybe they needed to express themselves in ways that didn't quite fit into their group's musical style. They also could have just been looking for a way to blow off some creative steam. Those are just a few of the reasons why so many famous songwriters, singers, and musicians have released solo albums. And also, if there's anything we've learned from rock music history, it's that creative musicians often like to have multiple projects happening at the same time. So in this episode, let's look at a few artists whose debut solo projects made for great and unique musical statements. Under his adopted name, Iggy Pop, James Osterberg was the co-founder of one of rock and punk's most influential bands, the Stooges. Iggy's wild on-stage antics and machismo bluster, both of which complemented the band's aggressive material, earned him the title the Godfather of Punk. The band, in various incarnations, released 3 albums between 1969 and 1973. The third album in the trilogy, 1973's Raw Power, was co-produced with Iggy by Stooges fan David Bowie. Iggy Pop's debut solo album, The Idiot, was released in 1977. This release marked a radical departure from the incendiary, guitar-based proto-punk of his former band. The Idiot was written and recorded in collaboration with David Bowie, and its electronic veneer and melancholic atmosphere had a lot in common with Low, Heroes, and Lodger, the 3 David Bowie albums that are commonly referred to as his Berlin Trilogy. Now, it's been widely documented that Bowie played a vital role in Iggy Pop's artistic rebirth, not just through shaping The Idiot, but also in helping him to get his life back on track during the mid-70s. Now, indeed, when the Stooges split in disarray after 1973's Raw Power, Iggy Pop struggled with personal issues, even spending some time in a California mental institution. Bowie, though, stuck by his friend, later taking Iggy along as his companion on his own extensive 1976 live tour in support of his album Station to Station. Following that tour, in July of 1976, Bowie and Iggy Pop holed up in Chateau d'Herville, the same French location where Bowie had recorded his covers album Pin-Ups in 1973 and would soon record much of Low. Bowie and Pop then set about putting together many of the songs which would feature on The Idiot. The sessions were loose and spontaneous in design, and the 2 musicians were augmented by bassist Laurent Thibault and drummer Michel Santangeli, who added their parts to rough tracks that had already been taped by Bowie. During these initial sessions, the Bows supplied Bowie and Pop with a tape loop of industrial noise, which laid the foundation for The Idiot's remarkable closing track, Mass Production. According to Paul Trinka's Iggy Pop biography, Open Up and Bleed, Bowie was, quote, like a child transfixed by a train set when he heard the tape, which had been sliced together in sections, and went on to supply the ominous droning backup for the song. Its oppressive atmosphere was perfectly matched by Iggy Pop's numbed-out lyric, which he said was inspired by his memories of watching a machine press at Ford Motors' River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan. During the Chateau sessions, Bowie and Pop worked up 2 future classics, China Girl and Night Clubbing. The former reflected on Iggy Pop's then relationship with his Asian girlfriend, and David Bowie would later re-record the song for his multi-platinum 1983 album, Let's Dance. There's a beautiful obbligata romantic melody at the end. It's echoed by those sort of gypsy guitars, if you will, Iggy Pop said in a 2019 interview. And that was a melody that David wrote. I thought it was truly lovely. Night Clubbing, meanwhile, sprang from an incident during downtime at the Chateau after The Idiot's initial sessions wound down. Allegedly inspired by some cheap Halloween masks and an old-time melody that Bowie began playing on the studio piano, The tune inspired Pop to write a lyric with Bowie that was mostly based on my experiences tagging along to the discos of Europe. They wrote it in little more than 20 minutes. That memorable loping beat for night clubbing, a haunting song that featured on the soundtrack of the film Trainspotting, came to fruition out of necessity simply because there was no one around to play the drums that day. The only thing left to augment the song in the room was a little Roland drum machine, Iggy said. David Bowie said, "I can't put out a song with something like that as a drum track." So I said, "No, but I can." And he got that. So we did it with that, and that beat has been sampled in a lot of very successful hip-hop records since then. Good on you guys. Additional sessions for excellent songs like Fun Time, the pulsing electropop of Sister Midnight, and Iggy's hypnotic paean to the Stooges' Dum Dum Boys were finished off with overdubs from David Bowie's regular rhythm section in studios in Munich and Berlin. The Idiot effectively resurrected Iggy Pop's career. It peaked inside the top 75 of the Billboard 200 in the US, and it even snuck into the UK top 20, giving Iggy the momentum to follow through with the abrasive, guitar-streaked Lust for Life album later in 1977. The album's reputation has since grown exponentially. Though it was greeted by relatively modest reviews in 1977, pop biographer Paul Trinka has asserted that The Idiot, quote, prefigured the soul of post-punk, and that the record's futuristic landscapes are still being absorbed by popular culture today. The album has since been cited as a touchstone by influential artists ranging from Depeche Mode and R.E.M. to Joy Division and Nine Inch Nails. Although Sushi Sue perhaps put it best when she said, "The Idiot provided, quote, a reaffirmation that our suspicions were true. The man is a genius." The relationship between the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards, and Mick Jagger hit a historic low in the mid-1980s. Keith Richards said in 2010 that while Mick Jagger was testing out the solo waters, he, quote, started to become unbearable. The rift between the two of them was palpable and audible. As a result, 1983's Undercover of the Night and 1986's Dirty Work were two Stones albums that reflected a lackluster attempt at keeping up with the times. So, it was not a surprise that in 1988, Keith Richards would take advantage of time off in the Stones' schedule to venture into the studio with a crack band that included guitarist Waddy Wachtel, keyboard player Ivan Neville, and drummer-producer Steve Jordan. He dubbed them the Expensive Winos. The resulting album was a surprise. It wasn't just the fact that Keith Richards had released the debut solo LP by pretty much the last 60s icon who had never gone solo, but he had also released an album with a loose vibrancy that had been lacking in his primary project. Rolling Stone magazine reviewer David Frick called it a masterpiece of underachievement. Talk is Cheap was rare among works by middle-aged rockers at the time. While many of Keith's contemporaries felt compelled to address the MTV era with programmed drums and albums that seemed to deny their own histories, Take It So Hard, the first single from Talk is Cheap, had it both ways. Despite its raw, roomy feel and hollered backing vocals and its garage gang vigor, the song still managed to get a ton of MTV play. There are a number of other highlights on Talk is Cheap. Struggle is taut, speedy, and is full of sharp-elbowed guitars. How I Wish comes off as a missing 80s Rolling Stone single. You Don't Move Me has a classic, jagged Keith Richards guitar riff and growled lyrics that seem to allude directly to the blossoming fraternal feud between the two Glimmer Twins. I mean, all you have to do is listen to the bite in the line, "Why you think you ain't got no friends." Great stuff. Talk is Cheap was not meant to signify anything, and that was the huge part of its charm. But in its own way, it proved to be prophetic. The year after its release, the music industry would see a huge boom in 60s identified artists getting back to their roots after struggling to pilot their way through the 80s. Lou Reed won accolades with the street-level commentary of New York. Neil Young balanced raging noise and acoustic ache on his album Freedom. And Bonnie Raitt would win multiple Grammy Awards with the subtle introspect and blues resolve of Nick of Time. Keith Richards himself recently said that the experience of recording solo made him appreciate working with Jagger. And so the Stones were back in 1989 too, sounding undeniably Stones-like on the album Steel Wheels. Now, somewhat poetically, the song that some consider to be that album's best was written by Keith Richards. Slipping Away is moody, elegant, and brimming with reflectiveness and middle-aged self-examination. It alludes to hard-living mortality and perhaps the Stones' own difficult state at the time. It was also a moving moment of détente with Jagger, who lent spirited vocals to that song's resiliently hard-swinging bridge. The Glimmer Twins were back on this one, singing the line, "It seems I've lost my touch," together. But Talk is Cheap may actually have served as a reminder of where they could find it. Things should have been looking up for musician Phil Collins in early 1981. His band Genesis was finally getting some mainstream recognition after drifting somewhere a little above cult territory for nearly a decade. But at the cusp of turning 30, Genesis's singer and drummer's personal life was in turmoil. His 5-year marriage to the mother of his only son began to fall apart. And so, after having spent the past few years writing and singing songs about mythical forest creatures and other standard progressive rock topics, Phil Collins used his solo debut to vent his hurt, frustration, and confusion about his impending marital breakup. From the album's harrowing opener, In the Air Tonight, to its penultimate track, the fragile ballad, If Leaving Me Is Easy, Face Value remains the most personal record that this artist has ever made. Ironically, it was the group Genesis's success following the release of their 1978 album, And Then There Were Three, and the massive world tour that accompanied it, that was partly to blame for Collins' divorce. But Collins was determined to work it out, and he took a break from the band to try to patch together what was left of his marriage. By the winter of 1979, however, Collins' wife was gone, leaving him alone in the house with only his feelings. He soon got to work, creating songs like In the Air Tonight, I Missed Again, and You Know What I Mean, that would all end up on Face Value, which he would release in February of 1981. One song about the new special woman in Collins' life, This Must Be Love, did let a little bit of light into the darkness. And interestingly, Collins' 1984 #1 hit, Against All Odds, Take a Look at Me Now, was actually written for Face Value, but he left it off the album because he didn't want to weigh it down with too many ballads. But even if the general tone of the record was one of hurt and heartbreak, Collins was shrewd enough to disguise some of them in some cheery pop music hooks, like on I Missed Again, the album's first single, which cracked the top 20. He also weaved some unrelated non-breakup songs into the mix, including a cover of Genesis's own Behind the Lines, which first appeared in a much heavier form on the band's Duke album from the year before. By employing Earth, Wind & Fire's Phoenix horns and swerving into radio-friendly R&B territory on some songs, Phil Collins made sure that Face Value wasn't all about tears. But it is the sadness that stands out on the album in a way. The haunting In the Air Tonight sounds like it's narrated by a ghost, or at least a shell of a man, for its whole first 3 minutes or so. And then when that famous cascade of tumbling drums finally breaks the mood, the song remains as much about the futile attempt to bottle up simmering frustration as it does about that release. Very well done musically. There's no mistaking that something is ripping up Phil Collins inside when you listen to this album. As for the ballads, there are far more here than had ever appeared on any single Genesis album up to that point. And there is genuine hurt and ache to be found in every word and every note sung. Thankfully, Genesis fans followed Phil Collins on his inaugural solo outing. Face Value climbed to #7, higher than any of his band's previous albums. though their LP Abacab, which was going to be released later in 1981, also made it to number 7. Within a few years, Phil Collins' solo success would outpace the group's. He would score 7 number-1 singles and 2 number-1 albums, while Genesis's highest charting album, 1986's Invisible Touch, only made it to number 3, even though the record's title song was also the group's only number-1 single. And all of it started with a personal and cathartic work that stemmed from one of the lowest periods in Phil Collins' life to that point. That he was able to make his definitive solo statement and go on to lead Genesis to bigger things over the next decade says so much about his drive and productivity. The popularity of both acts would expand dramatically before the 80s were over. That is all for now on Tony T's Tune Talk look at some of rock's best debut solo albums. Remember that all of the excellent music that's been discussed here can be found on the streaming services available through your local public library. Thanks for watching and happy listening.